Welcome back to the Jasa channel. Special episode for you today, the glass water wheel. Gonna make the wheel itself a stand to hold everything in place, a reservoir to continually drip the water, and finally the cups used to transfer the power. And speaking of power, we'll be checking out a large motor that'll be used in upcoming projects. But first, I need to do the stand. I'm starting off with these flat rods to bend up a rectangular base. So give them a slight heat in the flame and begin to bend them into right angles. I can use my marving pad to check the angle to make sure it's right. So normally you would use round rods, but I've picked up some of these flat and even some triangular rods for different projects. I used it in the recent flashlight video to separate the batteries in this battery case. And so I didn't get too many of these just because I normally recommend you buy your glass in bulk to get the best discount prices. And now that I have all my corners finished up, it's time to melt down the last one and pull out that little bit left. So this is a special episode for hitting the 2,000 subscriber mark. Now I actually started working on this project a while back, but since it took so much time and ended up being about 15 hours of footage, so I was working on other projects to keep the channel rolling. You might notice the glass science sign is back. This one took some damage in the explosive spinner episode. A piece of shrapnel took out a few of the letters there. And of course, don't repeat these experiments at home. I always take extra caution when I'm doing my science. And now you might notice my torch is moving around a little bit, which isn't very normal. This is actually my starter torch, the Bobcat, which I've converted into a hand torch. I took off the base and attached a large L bracket for a handle. And then I ran the gas lines down the handle for safety. And here I'm melting in some support pillars to build up the base. Going in on the front and the back to make sure it's fully melted in, making sure it's extra solid. So heating the glass up to a molten point begins to cause it to glow, a nice orange-red color. You can see it fading away as it cools and sets up. For a proper solid attachment, you want to heat up both sides, the base and the rod, very, very hot, very molten, and then attach them together in the flame. This is known as a hot seal attachment. It creates a permanent connection between the two pieces, fully melted together. If one side was a lot cooler than the other, then you could end up with a cold seal attachment, which would end up fusing the glass together, not actually melting it together. So the cold seal attachment would end up holding on to the piece but breaking with a simple vibration. Whereas a hot seal attachment will bring both pieces together, creating one solid piece of glass. And then it's also important to hold it very still. You don't want to wiggle it around. This will cause stress in the connection as it's trying to settle. This is definitely my largest project to date, so I normally don't do kinetic sculptures like this. But I wanted to do something extra large for the 2,000 mark, something cool. I normally do pendants and marbles besides all the science projects. But picking up some of these basic techniques that I'm showing you, you can really take it anywhere you want, really make anything. And so I'll start connecting these top pillars for my reservoir, the water tank for the project, So this first one's going to be a little hard to do. I'll start driving some heat into both of the areas. I want to get them up to a working temperature, which is about 1,000 degrees. Now I'm trying to hold it apart now a little bit as I get both areas molten and then push them together in the flame. Now I do recommend these smaller torches to practice on. Just starting out, you could use these to really practice almost any technique. However, what you make is going to end up being a lot smaller than what it probably should be on a larger torch. But then being able to have an alternative use for it, a hand torch like this, is pretty sweet. It's not going to be the best hand torch, but it'll get the job done. And now this next connection isn't as favorable. As I said before, it's good to get both areas molten before they come in contact. And here I'm most likely going to get a layer of air trapped between them. But that's okay. I'm really aiming more for functionality here in this piece. And now you won't want to miss the upcoming project, the ultimate mixture of aesthetics and functionality. The Staff of Light. This is just the prototype. The actual staff will be blindingly bright. The battery section will consist of 11 AA batteries. I went with rechargeable batteries just for how power hungry the staff will be. And I'm hoping to get that done by the end of the year, maybe even make it the 50th video. That'd be cool. But now because of winter and how cold it gets here, my shop is pretty much shut down for the season. It's hard to keep it climate controlled when you have a large ventilation system. And for the kiln, it likes to be above freezing to operate. So if you're planning to sell any of your work, I always recommend to run it through a kilning cycle first. It'll help take the stress out of your glass during the cooling phase, and that way it won't break on your customers. But your kiln is a pretty big decision. It's one you have to make sure fits your shop and fits what you're going to be making. You might end up upgrading your torch before you upgrade your kiln. And so I have some good questions here from a commenter, CornShadow97. And the first one here is, how did I learn to do this art form? Glass blowing, or in this case, lampworking. And it really just started with videos like this, like I'm doing right now. And it's also a large reason why I do the videos. I think it's important to have, open knowledge like that, just free access to just better yourself if you want to put the time into it. And I know a lot of people do like to learn in person, so it kind of depends on your learning style. But like I said, personally, if you're willing to put the time into it, and you have that dedication, then I want to give you the right tools to get started, the right knowledge. But speaking of tools, the next question is, what tools to begin with? Now, your most important tools to practice with are your hands. You're just learning how to rotate the glass and maneuver it around and how to work with it. But besides that, I would go with a pair of serrated tweezers, a small pair and a long one. And then maybe a couple graphite pads, a few graphite rods. I have a couple videos of making some tools with graphite. You can always add more tools as you're progressing through it and learning what kind of tools you use the most. But if you do plan to do a lot of hollow or functional work, then I do recommend a good pair of jacks. Jacks are a traditional glass blowing tool. They have multiple uses. Here I'm using them to flare open a tube. And for the glass itself, you're most likely going to have to order it online. It is pretty expensive to ship glass, so it's always best to buy in bulk. Here's a full case or a crate right here. They're up to about 50 pounds and anywhere from 100 to 300 bucks. What techniques should I start practicing? So there really are a lot of techniques and a lot of things to learn in glass blowing, But then there are some more general basic techniques that you would use multiple times per project. And so if I were to start out from scratch, I would begin with separating a tube or a rod, try to attach it back together like it was, work on condensing or contracting the glass up into a marble, and lastly the glass blowing, puffing into a tube to create a sphere. But right here I'm swiping some glass off this tiny tube to even it out. And then I'll use my jacks and a reamer to flare it open. It will be the bearing that will hold the wheel up and allow it to spin. But then don't forget about safety. You have eye protection, ventilation, flashback arresters, and just general fireproofing that needs to be done. And now you can see a good view of the jets here from the propane. These are often called the candles of the torch. And depending on how yellow to blue they are, you can tell how much oxygen is in the flame. Here you'll see they're pretty much completely blue, which indicates a very oxidized flame. So a reduced amount of oxygen would be called the reduction flame. And this is important because some colors will be more reactive to what kind of flame you use. And you never want to work inside of the candles. A good working area would be right in front of them, right about here. And as you go farther outside in the flame, it gets colder. So out towards the tip of the flame would be the coldest area, and it'd be good to warm things up or anneal things there. And real quick, I thought a small detail to point out is these aren't actually torches, but burners. A torch is usually something that carries its own fuel source with it, whereas a burner is just a device used to burn a fuel source. There's no fuel included. And now I am impressed with the design of these burners. They're similar to the acetylene torches used for cutting and welding, except that they're primarily surface mix, which means that they'll separate the fuel and the oxygen until all the way to the surface, the end of the torch. And now doing it this way does make the flame a little cooler than pre-mixing it inside of the torch, but it is overall a lot safer. By separating the fuel and the oxygen, it greatly reduces the risk of a flashback, whereas the flame will travel backwards into the torch and into your tank, blowing it up. But with that said, there is still a small risk, so you definitely want to get those flashback arresters. And other than that, the surface mix is much more quiet. It is very nice to work with, and it usually makes a larger, wider flame compared to the premix, which is hotter but concentrated into a smaller area. Now back to the smaller torch that I turned into a handheld one. It is the same as the center fire of my 2-stage torch. The second stage will double your flame size, which will allow you to essentially double the size of your finished work. So solid work on a small torch like this, a marble might come out to be 1.5 inches in size, and then for hollow work, probably about 3 inches. So for solid, that's about the size of a golf ball, and for hollow work, that'd be about the size of a tennis ball. And then to see some good examples of what you can do with a 2-stage torch, I recommend checking out some of my videos. Everything I've done so far has been with this 2-stage torch. The magnet apparatus video was a pretty good example of a large vessel. It has a 1-inch neodymium magnet doing a magnetic field test. But don't forget to check out my favorite one, the glass cannon, which in the nature of itself is a contradiction. How could something commonly known to be fragile as glass prove to be indestructibly powerful like a cannon? And now as I apply heat to the glass and bring it closer to a liquid molten state, it begins to emit light, a reddish orangish color, which at its most intense will become white. Then as I stop applying heat, it begins to cool down. It radiates out heat, trying to equalize with the surrounding temperature. And as it begins to set back up to solid, below 1,000 degrees, the glow will slowly fade away. But now this glow is very dependent on what is inside of the glass. Certain colors will have different elements inside of them, different metals. And depending on how that element reacts to light, or if it has a lower melting point than the glass itself, then it can start to glow at lower temperatures or glow a lot brighter. So for yellow or orange, they might use cadmium. For blue or black, they'll use cobalt. And then gold and silver create a mix of different colors, anything from a bluish green to an amber purple. The cadmium here has a very low melting point, 610 degrees, causing it to glow before the clear glass will. And you don't have to fully understand what this chart means to read it, just relating the numbers from one to the other should give you some good insight into the differences. So for example, on conductivity, this is a unit of measurement. And for silver, it's at 400 and cobalt is 100. So that would tell us silver is 4 times as conductive as cobalt. And now the electrons, which basically represent the area or space that this atom will take up. More technically, it's the probability to find a given amount of electrons in a given area. So on the far left, the 2s would represent the area right next to the nucleus, the closest to the center of the atom. And the 2s and 1s on the opposite side represent the farthest distance away from the atom, the very edge. And so each area will make up what they also call shells, and that outside shell is called the valence shell. And basically it is a special shell because it's the one that makes contact or comes in reach of the other atoms and their valence shells. So you might notice silver and gold, for example, have 1 electron there, and they are also highly conductive. With a single electron there, it gives it extra space to move around and carry energy. And it does get a little bit more complex than that. The electrons will usually fill up the closest shell first and work their way out. But just depending on the probability and how they're reacting to each other, you can get just different kind of geometric shapes and patterns. So this round atom would be kind of the basic shape you would find. Something among the smaller elements like hydrogen. And now as I'm attaching the bearing to the rack, I want to make sure to fully heat up and melt in both sides. If I don't fully melt it in, it could crack due to thermal expansion. Some materials will expand more or less depending on how much heat is applied to them. They'll take up more area. And when this happens as it's cooling, it can result in stress in the glass, causing it to break later. So depending on what kind of glass you want to work with, you're going to have different rates of expansion. Soft glass is traditionally what is used in artistic glass blowing. But with today's advances, it's a lot easier to melt borosilicate or lab glass. And quartz has such a high melting point, it's really difficult to do much with it. Quartz rods are pretty expensive. But speaking of expenses, Lampworking does take a little bit of extra money to get started in. So with a basic setup, a small torch, and no kiln, you should expect at least $500. Blowing glass outside could help your budget a bit, as ventilation is a big part of it. I've attached a punty to this rod. I'm going to go ahead and pull out a small section and use that to form up the wheel. And so a little bit more about my story of how I got into glass blowing. So I used to do some custodial work for a small business. I would do some cleaning, replace some light bulbs, fix up some chairs. Just basic stuff to get a business going in the morning. And to be honest with you, I'm actually really happy to be doing this now. Not because the other place was bad. I mean, I did enjoy working there. I'm really thankful for the opportunity I got to make the money to do this. But here, I just have more of a chance to fulfill my potential, really show you what I can do. So now I have to thank YouTube also for giving me this opportunity to put me out there. I think knowledge is very important. It's good to have a platform like this to where you can pick up new skills and information. And now I'll start heating up that section and it'll begin to gather back into a large sphere. I'll have to hold it mostly level while I keep rotating, or else it will slump towards gravity. And a good demonstration of this technique would be the glass wand video. In that video, I gathered up a very large sphere to make a magical wand of attraction, but for this video, I'm going to press it out into a flat disc. Just a very beautiful shot here. Then these rings have formed up from the pressing process. They kind of remind me of a fingerprint. But it's from the glass quickly solidifying as it touches the surface, and then the molten glass behind it cascades over, creating a series of rings. And so before I started into glassblowing, I actually took almost a year just researching and learning more about it. And not just the techniques or how to do it, but simple things like the physics involved, the thermodynamics, the chemistry. These are a few subjects that you could brush up on before you get started. And real quick, I want to thank everyone who's subscribed up to the channel so far. This was meant to be a bonus video or a bonus project to celebrate the 2,000 subscriber mark. And it was such a large project, I actually started it a while back. And although I finished it, I didn't have enough time to edit it and make this video. So I'm now getting to that, and I figured I'd make it a little extra long than what I normally do. But it was a lot more footage than normal, about 15 hours. So I did cut out a little bit, but like a good story, you need to leave in the best details. So I want to thank you again for subscribing. But in case this is the first video you've seen of mine, then I'd like to welcome you to the channel. Go ahead and come in, relax, have a coffee. And it's not always about glass blowing or lamp working. A lot of times it's just fun projects. A lot of blowing stuff up, a lot of just seeing what can be done with the glass. So feel free to comment any questions you have or projects you might want to see. I just ask you keep the language appropriate for the younger viewers. So really, everyone's welcome here on the channel. I like to treat everyone equally. And what I've seen in glass blowing is it does tend to be more of a community than a competition. We all start at the beginning, we all have to work our way up and get better. So it's good to help each other out. If someone's struggling, give them a push forward. And then as they start to climb up the ladder, they'll reach back and grab your hand, pull you up with them. That's what building a nice community is about. But of course, with that said, there are competitions out there. People putting their glass against each other to see who can make the best work. I just imagine it'd be hard to judge unless you were looking at cracks or bubbles. I mean, if you had perfect works, then how would you figure out which one was better? And so to prevent any cracks or bubbles in my work here, I'm going to have to do a very nice hot seal. For a proper hot seal or a proper connection, you want to heat both areas of the glass to molten and then connect them in the flame. If one of the sides isn't hot enough, you might end up with a cold seal connection. It means that the connection is not fully melted together and a slight vibration could end up knocking them apart. Sometimes you'll use a cold seal for a temporary connection on something like a marble when you don't want to leave any remaining glass when you break the connection. And now this project was before I bought my GoPro camera. In my more recent videos, I have a first-person view that I switch back to and forth, and that way you can see more of what's going on. And then it also records in a higher frame rate. So for explosive art, you have the one on the right, which is 120 frames per second, and the one on the left, which is only 60. So you get smoother video and get more information about what's going on. And it's looking complete. I got all the rods on there. It's looking pretty even too. Might have to hit the space bar to pause it to see, but I'm gonna just flame anneal it in the outside of the flame here, and then start working on the cups. And I'll go in to attempt to pull a point here, which is more of a traditional technique. It's used to separate your tubing while at the same time creating a blow tube on the end. You wanna heat up a nice band of glass, keep your hands aligned, and slowly pull apart, making sure to keep rotating the tube at the same time. And the faster you pull, the thinner the tube will be, but the slower you pull, the thicker it will be. And as I'm pulling it apart, oops, I end up hitting the wheel. So I'll have to check it for damage. I think the axle might have broken off there. And it looks like the rods are fine. I'll just have to repair the axle. That's okay. So it's a good idea to be aware of the space around you and your surroundings. It helps to clean up your bench to prevent accidents. But accidents do happen. That's how I lost 3 of these signs so far. It was during Explosive Spinner 2. That's why I make it spin with an explosive, but on the second test it just blew up. A chunk of glass got around the protective barricade, taking out a few of the letters. And as always, you don't want to try these experiments at home. They can be a bit dangerous. So leave it up to me and try the glass blowing out instead. And now I'll be doing some more beginner projects, things that'll be a little bit easier to do yourself. But for someone looking for an advanced one, kind of a challenging project, I would recommend glass dice. It can be a little difficult to get the shape and the dots right, but check out the video for that tip on making the dots really pop with that lensing effect. And what I've been doing was pulling the tube apart into smaller and smaller sections using that point technique. And now the pulling points technique is usually a more difficult one to learn, but if you're having trouble with it, I recommend just switching to the blow tube connection method and then coming back to it later. I normally will use the connection method for a heavier piece to hold on to a big weight, but for smaller projects, I do like the pulled points because they're lighter on your wrist and easier to rotate. And so what I did here was connect a punty to the end of this bubble. And I'm going to heat up a very thin band and pull it out as I blow into it. And this thins out the walls very thin, about the width of a hair. It makes it very easy to pop a hole into it and melt it open. And so when the glass is pulled out or stretched out thin enough, it becomes flexible. Here's some flexible glass right here. Being much thinner causes it to react very differently on a molecular scale. You have to keep in mind the difference of temperature between the inside layer of what you're working on versus the outside layer, or the surface that's exposed to the room temperature air. So because this glass is so thin, it's practically the same thing. It's like a single one-sided layer of glass. You can see me bending it all over the place here. And now with that tube open, I'll begin to spin out the rim of this cup. And this is one of those classic glass blowing techniques that I'm happy to share with you. And so for a long time, glass blowing has actually been pretty fiercely protected. The knowledge and techniques for it, especially in places like Murano, where if caught sharing trade skill secrets, you could end up losing your hands, to prevent you from sharing to any outside communities. And of course, this was in the past, mind you. Things have changed since then. I don't think that still happens. But that was done to protect the profits of what they made, to keep the value in it by not having anyone else be able to do it. And that's of course the opposite of how I feel. If I could take all my knowledge and just plug it into your brain through a little USB cord, I would. And if it only took a second to do, then why not do it for free? It doesn't hinder me at all. It only takes a second. But to learn a proper spin out will take a lot longer than that. You want to keep the heat towards the rim of the bubble and then use that centrifugal action to pull the walls out. You can keep progressing the heat downward towards the punty to open it up further and further. This was a technique used to make wine glasses. And since I don't drink, I don't actually practice this technique, but it is easier to do on a larger torch also. You can try to turn the propane up a little bit to get a wider flame. But other than that, you do want to even out the rim of the cup before you start spinning it, or else it won't spin out evenly. So I'm using a clear rod to swipe off some of the extra glass to even it out. And to do that, you just heat up the glass you want to remove more than the glass you're removing it with. So you want that rod to be much colder than the molten area. And now if it's too cold, it might not actually stick at all, as it's too solid for the other side to form into it. Which is cool to know. I'll have to make a video to show you that, but you usually won't have that problem, as a radiant heat will heat up the rod as you begin to touch. And that is something you want to remember to protect your skin from. Your hands, your face. When you start to make bigger projects, especially with a larger torch like this one, the glass will radiate a lot of heat. So that was one of the biggest differences I noticed upgrading from that smaller torch. I had to move my hands back further. And so I'm just flame polishing the marks out of that last one, and here they are. And now I made a few more than I need. What's important is to get the weight the same. That way the wheel will be balanced. And so I found the 8 cups that were the closest. These are all within a gram of weight. And I'll go ahead and group them up, putting the heaviest ones together and the lightest ones together, then separate those two on the opposite sides of the wheel. And this should help ensure balance, as 2 of the heavier cups won't end up being next to each other on the wheel. And now here's the stand itself. So this is definitely the largest glass project I've done so far, and the most time involved. Now just to put it in there without breaking any of the rods off, or the axle itself, and with a quick spin, it looks like it's working. And so it looks like it might end up spinning its way out of the bearing. So I might need to make a little tube to hold it in place. And this is one of the pulled points I did. I'm just using my claw grabbers to hold on to it, and my tweezers to open up the other end. So a little bit more about me. I do like video games or computer games. And now I don't play as much as I used to. I've been dedicating a lot of my time more to the glassblowing and YouTube here. But some of the classics I grew up with was Super Mario Brothers, Sonic the Hedgehog, Zelda, Link to the Past. That was definitely one of my favorite Zeldas. And then Mega Man, Bomberman. And then last but never least, Final Fantasy. And besides video games, I have spent a lot of time on computer games. Me and my brother spent countless hours playing Warcraft and Warcraft 2 back in 1994 and 95. Our dad used to work in computers back then, so we had access to a lot of old games and different kind of softwares. And besides that, I've played a lot of FPSs, first-person shooters, a lot of Counter-Strike. I played a few seasons in a league. I did enjoy it. I like those matches, those high-pressure situations when everything's on the line. It's usually when I feel like I do a lot better. And it sounds crazy, but it really does get your adrenaline going. When you have 4 other people just watching your every move, just hoping you succeed. and then the opposite 4 people are hoping you fail. It all comes down on the line. It all comes down to you. And so for something a little bit fun, something a little bit new to the channel, I might do a couple gaming videos. Maybe some retro games. And of course, if you're not into games, that's okay too. The first one I'd like to do is Doom, the original one from the 90s. That's one of them that I grew up with and I still like to play today. Now, being Doom, it does have a little bit of a graphic nature to it, so it's not best for the younger viewers. But of course, it's not as graphic as the more recent Doom versions. Things tend to kind of evolve and get more complex as time goes. And so now you can see the incredibly tiny flame there. Very hot and sharp flame for very delicate work. And just like the other solid connections, I want to heat up both areas very, very hot, very molten, and connect them in the flame. You can see I have a bit of aluminum foil to protect from the rising heat. Since I haven't been able to anneal anything in the kiln, pretty much everything has a little bit of stress left in it, so I'm being careful not to flash any heat around to cause me sudden cracks. And I thought this might be the easiest way to do it, to have gravity kind of hold it in place. Sometimes you can use gravity as a tool too. Take a condenser, for example, which is basically a tube inside of a larger tube. If the inside tube is touching the wall, you could heat up the top area where it's connected. You can tilt the tube and use gravity once it's liquid to realign it. So it's a pretty cool little tip when you can't actually reach inside of the vessel itself. And so these black gloves are made of Kevlar, which makes them heat resistant. They won't catch fire in the flame as cotton gloves might. And although there are some more hazardous elements in glass blowing, the biggest thing is not taking any risks. Prepping your studio for the right environment, and then prepping yourself and preparing yourself to work safely in the studio. So a few things to keep in mind would of course be the heat of the glass, but also sharp edges. It's good to check the edge of your blow tube before you put it to your mouth so you don't cut your lip. And it's never a good idea to swipe your bare hand over your work area, especially if you're working with frit. These little particles of glass might get stuck in your skin. Now, hot metals tend to be a little bit extra damaging to your skin since they're a bit more conductive. So you really want to avoid touching the end of the torch, the tip area, and also hot tools. And an oddly specific but important tip, don't work with band-aids on your fingers. That absorbent cotton part can end up absorbing or being saturated with oxygen. And at that point, when you get it near the flame, it'll most likely combust, and on top of being taped to your finger, it's a pretty bad situation. And it would seem like it would be a rare thing to warn people about, but as you can imagine, you might get a cut working with the sharp glass. So just one thing leads to the other. You know how it goes. Now I'm melting in some top rods to hold up the water tank. And so they call this yellow to orange light coming off the glass sodium flare. We'll use a special pair of protective glasses to filter out the light. It uses a material called didinium. Then you also need a UV filter, which is just a darkening shade like sunglasses, but a little darker. And then the thing is, you can get both of those filters, the didinium and the UV filter, combined into one pair. Or you can get the flip up UV shields, or even a face mask. And I know it seems a little inconvenient to do layered protection, but personally I think that's probably the best option. That's just by looking at the physics involved in it, and I definitely do recommend the face mask though. But not as much for small melts, like these little rods here. If you're doing a 2 to 3 inch marble, then that would probably be a good idea. And of course, it wouldn't hurt to mention again the ventilation. Very important, not only for the hazardous gases from the combustion process, but a large enough one will pick up frit and bubble trash and keep it from getting into your lungs. And then the flashback and flame arresters to keep your tanks from blowing up. And even though oxygen isn't actually flammable, at very high pressures, if anything that is flammable gets into it, it can suddenly combust. And they normally sell the arresters in pairs anyway, so it doesn't hurt to get one for the oxygen tank. Now, the only exception I would say would be possibly oxygen concentrators. They don't really build up that high of an overall pressure, so those arresters can kind of cause a resistance on the flow. So it's going to be harder for it to run. You might get a little bit less oxygen using it. And I know oxygen tanks are usually the preferred method. Those tanks will definitely give you better performance on the larger torches especially. But for a small torch or just for practice, these oxygen concentrators are a pretty good investment. They're pretty cool little machines. They basically suck in air, pressurize it, and push it through a filter to remove the nitrogen. And then what's left is about 20% oxygen, which it pushes to the torch. And so it uses up electricity to convert air into oxygen. And of course, like most things, they'll break down given enough time. About 20,000 work hours, and then it'll have to be rebuilt. And so speaking of cool little machines, I want to try to build one myself. So I picked up this 1 horsepower electric motor and a 12-volt battery. It's pretty powerful for only weighing 3 pounds. And then reversing polarity makes it run backwards. So I picked it up for a few possible projects, but mainly a glass blowing lathe. So I don't know if you caught that spark when I first connected it. That was pretty crazy. It did recommend connecting things while looking away from the terminal, and I think this is why. Which is also a good tip for your regulators on your tanks. Make sure to look away in the opposite direction to protect your eyes. The high pressured gas escaping could be enough to cause an eye injury. But more about the lathe, it's becoming more of a common practice to use lathes in glass blowing, to hold and rotate your work, taking some of the strain off yourself and also allow you to make larger pieces. But of course lathes are a little bit expensive, so I figured why not give it a try to build one myself. And so it is a high RPM motor. I'm gonna have to figure out some kind of gearing system to slow it down. But speaking of things going pretty slow, or in this case not at all, this old rideable RC car. I need to fix it up for my nieces. My brother bought it secondhand knowing it didn't work and gave it to me to fix it up. So I picked up this 6-volt 12-amp battery here, and this power line runs all the way up to this pedal, which acts as an on-off switch, like the one in the flashlight video. This switch here reverses the polarity or the direction of the motor. So I cut the connector off the old battery, stripped it down, and let's see if it works. I'll have to reach it with my glass hammer. Oh, and it's working. Look at that. Cool. So it was just the battery then. Let's check out to make sure the wheels are actually spinning. And yeah, there we go. What if we reverse the polarity? And the good news too is instead of getting the toy company battery, I ended up just buying a generic one for half the price. And it has twice the capacity as the original battery, so I might even do a couple upgrades to it. So I might clean it up, maybe give it a little bit of paint, and make a video out of it so you can see it fixed up. We'll see how that happens. But right here, I'm going in to make the reservoir. I rounded out the bottom of this 40mm tube, and now I'm picking out a small hole for a blow tube attachment. And so I'm just pulling glass out from the same area, causing it to get thinner and thinner until the flame just rips it right open. And this is a safer method for opening up holes in tubes. It doesn't have a large chance to create bubble trash like blowing them open does. And it's always good to finish the hole off with a reamer to make sure it's nice and round. And so I puffed out a thin bubble in the end of this tube so that I can open it up in the flame. I'm using a pair of jacks to flare the end open to attach it to the other tube. So it's a good idea to flare it for a proper seal over the other tube, but also it helps from the tube condensing down and closing up as you connect them together. And now I'm just heating up the bottom and puffing into it to round it out. I made 2 of these. I'm going to connect them together to make the final tank. Instead of using one really large tube, which would be difficult for me to maneuver, I'll use these 2 slightly large tubes and connect them together. And on top of that, it won't roll off the stand since it'll have kind of a bottom and a top. And so I'll focus my heat onto one area here on the tube and start to puff it out. And then if I'm planning to make a larger hole, I can reheat the area back down, contract it up, and puff it out again. And this helps to thicken up the wall thickness of that bubble I'm puffing out. So when I do pop the hole in it, it won't melt open very quickly, leaving a large hole. So with those thicker walls, I can pop open a smaller hole and slowly work it open. And so if you do end up popping open a thin hole like that, you could go around it with some extra glass to start to close it down. But a better option might be to cover it back up with glass and thicken it up and blow it out again. And I'm trying to open up the second hole the same diameter as the first one was. And I think that's looking pretty good right there. And so I turned up that dragon's fire. I'm gonna heat up both sides to molten and connect them in the flame. So it's looking pretty good. I don't see any holes. The next step here would be to go around the connection one part at a time and puff it out. I don't want to heat up the entire connection at once or it might lose stability. So it's good to break it up into 3 or 4 different sides and kind of work one area at a time. And now I'm holding onto the blow tube mostly. It might be a little heavy for that pulled point. But I'm slowly going around, blowing out that connected area. I want it to be about the same size as the tube itself. And then you might have noticed each time I blow into it, I have to cover the pulled point end in order to pressurize the vessel. And now to fill it up with water, I'll make a glass-on-glass fitting. It's important to shape most of the fitting with a reamer or a different tool before you use the glass-on-glass tool right here. The tool is meant to give it its final shape, so it's not really a reaming tool itself. So trying to put it in a flat tube will just cause trouble. And now I separated it, and I'm just going to open up the end, give it a tiny flare to keep it from closing up for the attachment. And the same thing for this tiny 5mm tube, which will be the drip spout. And it's less than a millimeter in thickness, so I'm going to thicken up the walls a little bit. That way the flare can hold up to a little bit of heat during the attachment process here. And as I normally recommend heating up both sides to molten for a proper attachment, this might be a slight exception. I'll instead put most of the heat into the vessel. I'll leave the flare a little bit colder so it doesn't end up condensed and closed, and then attach them real quick in the flame. So with those thin walls on that flare, it should melt into the other piece, no problem. So I popped another hole here. You can see the flame starting to enter into the vessel. I'm using the reamer to prep it for the glass-on-glass fitting. So I'm heating up both sides to molten and attaching them in the flame. I went ahead and removed the point. I'm going to take off a little bit of excess glass with my tweezers. Then I'll puff it out to make a nice round bottom. Now, in order to get pressure in the vessel, I'll have to cover up the fitting. And I could use my finger for this, but it would be a little safer to use a glass-on-glass tool or maybe a glass plug. And now a Kevlar glove wouldn't work for that, as it wouldn't fully seal the fitting. If it allows air to come through, then you could end up pulling heat from inside the vessel out. And that's looking pretty good right there. Making sure to even the walls out and also blowing it out will help with the stability. How the stress ends up getting distributed over a sphere or a curved area versus a flat one makes a little bit of a difference. And now to blow out the other side, I'm going to puff through the drip tube while covering the fitting. If I were to puff through the fitting, I might not need to cover the drip tube, just because there's a lot of air resistance already from how thin it is. And now I'll fill it up with some water, because it's time to run the test. And it looks like it's working. However, the water is coming out much farther than it's supposed to. It's completely missing the wheel. I'll go ahead and use my snips and cut it down a little bit. Alright, let's see how that works. So it seems like it's a little bit far. Maybe I'll cut it again, but oh hey, look at that, it's spinning. I'll go ahead and give it another snip here, being careful not to cut too much off. That could be a problem. And so I'm going to try to fill it up all the way to see if that makes a difference with the amount of pressure behind the stream. Now if you look in the top right, you can see as we start to lose capacity, we begin to lose pressure also. And this is a bit reminiscent of amps and voltage with electricity. In the flashlight episode, I kept referencing to water flow, and that really wasn't just for simplicity's sake. There really is some similarities between the two. The biggest difference would be scale or size of the measurement. And so when it comes to physics or in life in general, I usually feel there's more similarities than there are differences. Looking at the snowflake, for example, it is said that no two snowflakes are the same. And the reason for that is the environment causes each snowflake to form a little differently. And so with that characteristic in mind, that two snowflakes cannot form the same shape, it then makes all snowflakes similar. They're all sharing that characteristic of having a unique identity. Kind of like people. Alright, so it looks like the wheel itself is working. I'll have to just keep working on the reservoir. And now I can tell the balance is just a little bit off on the wheel. And that's sort of the difficult part of doing this in glass. If anything needs to be adjusted, I have to use a flame and reheat it. Whereas if it was metal or a different material, it might just be easily bent. And so I don't know why I didn't think of this earlier. I'll just bend the tube down instead of having it go forward. That probably would have worked better than cutting it so many times. And now it's too short to really bend it. I'll do what I can to bend the tip down a little bit. And now as I'm doing my adjustments, I have to be careful not to splash heat on that seal. might end up cracking it. Controlling your heat is very important in the process. But speaking of heat, since it's winter, my studio is pretty low on it right now. It's pretty cold in here. It's difficult to keep things climate controlled with the ventilation going. So I usually will shut down the studio for a little bit around this time of year. It has given me some extra time to work on this video and get it out for you. But I'm doing my best here to get a couple more videos made for YouTube. I know things usually start warming back up in March, so I'll get in full swing then. But let's go ahead and put a little bit of water in here and see if that bend is what I needed. There we go. Seems to be going pretty much straight down. And so I'll go ahead and try to fill it up full and we'll see it in action. Now I'm having some difficulty filling it up. There's not a lot of room for the air to escape out the top. I'm gonna have to get some more water here. And so here we go. Pretty cool when it spins around. Hey, and it's going at a pretty good speed too when it's at a full stream. You can see that weight imbalance causing it to slow down a little bit, but it's still working. Pretty happy how this turned out. That's kind of the best part of working on a project with your hands, is just sitting back and enjoying it when it's done. And that's kind of one of the reasons I do recommend the art form. Not just for profits, but for skill building, which can be a good part of self-improvement, learning a new skill. It helps to build confidence and motivate you. You know, it's hard to be disappointed in yourself when you're good at something. But that's gonna do it for this video. I really want to thank everyone for watching, for subscribing up, getting me past the 2,000 mark. That's really cool. Go ahead and leave a comment. You can ask a question or suggest a future video, or maybe you just want to say hi. I always enjoy hearing from you, and I hope you enjoyed this video. So thanks again for watching, and always have a great day.